Actually, Soham's computer with some problem. He has joined.
Okay, he's joined.
Okay, thanks. So we should start now. And good morning to all the students, teachers, and research scholars joining in from various parts of the country and the world. Today, on this very auspicious day, we welcome Professor Sekhar Bandhopadhyay to our college and to Delhi University city. It has been an honor for us, and to be very honest, we were very excited when he did say yes, which was almost like a year ago, and we kept our excitement within our task for a very long time, and we were more thrilled and more delighted when he revealed the topic that he's going to say on, and it was as I can't express my words on how excited we were, and I think everyone in here in the room, as well as those who are watching in YouTube, shared the same excitement and the same enthusiasm as we do. Now let's be honest, guys. As I don't think Professor Bandhopadhyay needs an introduction. We have all crossed his works and his books at various stages of our life and our careers. Yes, and for those who are still in their first years, I am sure that they will also cross Professor Bandhopadhyay's many works throughout their entire course durations and in the future as well. Yes, now, now I don't think I can say too much about Professor Bandhopadhyay's achievements. He is currently the Professor Emeritus in Victoria University of Wellington and also the head of the School of Philosophy, History. Okay. Uh, I do not, sir.
No, I'm retired.
Okay, sir. So
That's a bit
we didn't know.
information.
Okay, we didn't know that. Didn't know that. I asked sorry for that. That really, really sorry. And Professor Bandhopadhyay has also been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, and I can say a few of them, like the Rabindra Smriti Puruskar given by the government of West Bengal. He is also the fellow of the Royal Academy of New Zealand, and many more. His books include Caste Politics and the the Namasutras movement, and how can I ever forget the infamous book of his From Plassey to Partition and Beyond. It has been the guiding star, still is and still will be for most of the students in here who are just transitioning from the medieval to the modern period. His contribution towards history of modern India is undeniably a huge, and we are really witnessing a colossus standing in front of us. Now, before we proceed into the session, I just want to say a few words. Please refrain from using your mics at all the time during the speaker is speaking. For those who are in the YouTube, I also welcome them and to a lecture. And I personally, we are very sorry that we couldn't accommodate you within this room, but you are very much welcome to ask questions during the Q&A session, which will be taken up. Now, before we ask Professor Bandhopadhyay to ask our officiating principal and our teacher in charge, Professor Amrit Kaur Basra, to please speak a few words on this occasion.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Professor Sekhar Bandhopadhyay. On behalf of my college and academic and learning fraternity, I formally welcome you. Sir, I would like to say a few words that this was started in 1987 and history honors commenced with that. University of Delhi is going to celebrate its centenary year on 1st May 1922 when it was set up, and in the department Faculty of Arts, history was one of the first disciplines to be introduced. So we, as a student of University of Delhi and as a part of it, have always been part of, you can say, learning processes connected with history. Your contribution has been immense in the changing historiography on colonial and independent India. It's time that we should be knowing about the voices from below. So Dalit movement, which and your extensive work on Namasutra and the relationship between community, culture, and hegemony, these were relevant not only during colonial period but more are relevant now. So it's a time when we are talking about significant shifts in the historiography of colonial India. It's not merely for the purpose of learning, because I feel that our students, I'm sure, also feel the same way, that it has its bearing on our present day lives also. So we want a democratic year, and we are celebrating Azadi Ka Mahotsav, and our IQAC chairman, convener is also with us. So it's time that we should be having a truly democratic nation state where all finds their voices and respect. So, sir, I again welcome you, and we all are eagerly waiting to listen to you. Thank you.
Sir, you can begin at your
Okay.
own comfort.
Thank you, Professor Basra, for the warm welcome to Delhi University and its academic community. And thank you, Soham, for the very generous introduction. And I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting me, because I enjoy speaking, and I enjoy speaking particularly to colleagues and students, because I believe the true academic research is not only to acquire knowledge, but also to disseminate it as much as we can. Now, as you can see, the topic which I have suggested for today's lecture is rather a broad topic. It's the Dalit movement in Bengal before and after independence. Since it's a very broad topic, I will be dealing with it in also very broad outlines, and kind of will try to draw some theoretical issues, certain analytical points out of that. And at the end, during the question answer session, if there are questions on specific aspects of what I have said, I can go into more empirical details about that. So bear with me for the initial presentation, where I will be dealing with the subject in very, very broad outline. Now, as we know, the students of history who have studied Bengal, that it was from around the 5th century in the Christian era that the Varnashram as a social institution began to develop in the Bengal Delta. By 12th century, it had established its hegemony in the society of this region. And by 18th century, before the coming of the British, it was full-blown, and it was firmly entrenched in this part of India. And also, what is remarkable, not only Varnashram as a social institution was establishing its ideological hegemony, but also in course of time, 3 particular castes came up as the most dominant groups in these social structures. They were the Brahmins, Kayasthas, and Buddhas. And eventually, when the colonial rule came, they came to constitute a new elite group who came to be popularly known as the Bhadralok. Now, one of the studies shows that the Bhadralok in the 19th century actually belonged to as many as 18 castes, but one has to remember that majority of them belong to the 3 dominant castes, that is Brahman caste and Buddha, who kind of constituted a close social elite who controlled power in local society and local politics. And coming to the modernization phase, we see that the main source of their power was landholding. They retained a very strong connection with land. Then eventually, some of them went to trade in collaboration with the East India Company and the European merchants, but in most cases, the profit from trade was invested in land. So their connection with land was very conspicuous and very powerful. Then they took to education. They dominated the education sector, And when the colonial rule opened the new professions, they once again, because of their cultural capital, dominate the professional market. And eventually, when democratic politics began to develop and a new democratic public space began to develop, with reforms in the local self-government and new representative institutions were created, these public spaces were also dominated by this closed group. Now, it has been said about the culture of the Bhadralok elite is that one report in 1915 described it as, I quote, despotism of caste tempered by matriculation. In other words, there was some kind of an ambivalence. And we all know that these educated Bhadralok were behind the social reform movements, the so-called Bengal Renaissance in the 19th century. But it is also very conspicuous that none of the reform movements ever directly targeted the caste system. There were attempts to eradicate untouchability, but caste system, on the other hand, was justified and in fact valorized as an ideal social system as compared with the class system of the West. So in other words, there was this contradiction or ambivalence in the Bhadralok modernity as such. In the political field, they wanted democratic reforms, but they did not want these reforms to prejudice their own privileged positions. And therefore, there was a very strong antipathy and resistance to the empowerment of the people at the bottom, because these people claimed to represent the uneducated masses of the society. And to redress this balance, in 1919, a nominated seat for the depressed classes was created in the Bengal legislature, and this was very strongly resented by the Bhadralok elite. Now, from this very brief description, it may seem that the Bhadralok elite enjoyed an unchallenged dominance in society, politics, and economy. But it was not that. There was, from the very beginning, from the 19th century onwards, there had been resistance to this Bhadralok dominance, and this resistance came from several Dalit groups. So we find also in Bengal, simultaneously from the mid-19th, late 19th century, development of some articulate Dalit protest movements. Now, I would like to emphasize at the very beginning and very broadly that in the emergence of this Dalit protest movements, three factors were very important. The first was the number. The protest movement started only from among those groups who had the strength of numbers. It did not develop among the smaller groups or who were more marginal groups and could not kind of mobilize large number of people. Secondly, I would emphasize that in this movement, another crucial factor was some amount of social mobility. Although society and economy was otherwise very immobile, but it from time to time provided opportunities for sort of vertical upward social mobility for those who were at the bottom. And only when limited social mobility took place among any such group, creating a small counter-elite group who could provide the leadership for the protest movement, we find the emergence of articulate organized protest movements. The third factor which I would emphasize, and which is rarely looked at in Dalit studies, that is the importance of space. The movements took place where these groups were living in contiguous spaces. This contiguous space, the factor of space, contributed to these movements in three different ways. First of all, it constituted their identity in terms of their material possessions, their possession of land, their possession of houses, properties, and so on. So in terms of their material possession, the space constituted their identity. Secondly, the very ecology of that space, living in a contiguous space and the very ecology of the space conditioned and emotionally constructed their identity. I will illustrate this, what I mean, with examples. And thirdly, and most importantly, where a group lived in a contiguous space, it made it much easier for them to mobilize. So space also contributed to social mobilization and eventually political mobilization of the group. So importance of space is another third important factor which I will emphasize. And I will illustrate these three factors with three case studies, which I will discuss very briefly. The first one I will mention is the caste which I have studied in detail over the last 2 or 3 decades, and that was the Namushudris. The Namushudris emerged as a new peasant caste from among a variety of lower caste people who were known as the Chandalas in 18th or early 19th centuries. And these people lived mainly on fishing and boating. They were a kind of fishing boating community, and they lived mainly in the 6 eastern Bengal districts, which were kind of Dhaka, Bakarganj, Faridpur, Jessore, Khulna. Within this very close contiguous region, this lower caste fishing boating community emerged as a settled peasant community, because this was the marshy tracts. These were the marshy tracts of eastern Bengal, which were reclaimed, and these peasants acted as pioneer cultivators. From being a fishing boating community, they were gradually transformed into a settled peasant community. But the other factor which we also need to look at is the caste class intersection. In about, say, if I give you a little bit of statistics, in 1901, 75% of this population lived in 6 East Bengal districts. But in these districts, 78% of the Namushudras were agriculturists. They lived on agriculture, but while they lived on agriculture, only 1.15%, according to 1911 census, were rent receivers, had any income from rent, which means the rest of the agriculturist peasant population were landless peasants who were working in other people's land. And who owned this land? This land was mainly owned by Sayyid Muslims and upper caste Hindu Bhadralok Zamindars, who invested for the reclamation of the marshy tracts. And these peasants acted as pioneer cultivators. And when the land was reclaimed, they were sharecroppers or landless peasants in somebody else's land. But it is also significant that there was a 1.15% of this community who had rentier income, who became small peasant landholders and small zamindars. Eventually, they went to education, they got education, and eventually they formed their own association, the Namushudra Association, which was formed in 1912. But one has to remember that this movement started not in a modern platform, but in a rather pre-modern kind of situation. It started in 1872 when a rich peasant, Namushudra, invited all his village people to the funeral ceremony of his mother. Now the Kayasthas refused to attend. And when the Kayasthas refused to attend, the peasants of this village decided to boycott these landholding families and all Kayasthas who were entirely dependent on the labor of these people. And it started from one village, and it eventually spread to about 6 districts where the Namushudras remained. But the problem of the marginal communities is that they cannot sustain this kind of boycott movement, which involved economic boycott as well, for a very long time. So as a result of that, it went on for about 6 months, and then it gradually dissipated. But nevertheless, 1872 was the beginning of an articulate protest movement of a group of Namushudris against caste discrimination of the caste landlords. Eventually, they formed a religious sect, which was called the Matua sect, by two people coming from their own community, Harichand Thakur and Guruchand Thakur. And this Matua sect, like many other Dalit religious movements elsewhere, provided an ideology, an anti-caste ideology. It had an universalist universalist, humanistic kind of ideology in it, and it kind of brought this movement into a different kind of social space, from where it eventuated into the modern space of education, profession, and eventually having an organization called Namushudra Association in 1912. The other example I will cite was the Rajbangshi movement. What happened in the 19th century, the Kochs, which was a tribal group who lived in 4 North Bengal districts and in the princely state of Kuch Bihar, they acquired a new identity called Rajbangshi and claimed to be Khatriyas. About 88% of this population, of this caste population, lived in this 4 or 5 districts of North Bengal, once again living in a contiguous space, which made it easier for them to organize. And they had a previous history of tribal state formation, the Kuch Bihar Raj, excuse me, which brought further it facilitated further their social mobilization and political mobilization. So, and they also took advantage of the reclamation of the forest areas in North Bengal. When it was started by the colonial regime, the part of the forestry was being reclaimed, and the Rajbangshi peasants took advantage of them. By 1911, 89% of them were cultivators, but once again, only 1.5% were rent receivers. But there was a difference between the Namushudras and the Rajbangshis, because in Rajshahi, where their main concentration was there, in Rajshahi, 10.68% of the rent receivers were Rajbangshis. So in other words, in the Rajshahi division, they were in a better position to kind of assert their voice. And it is from this group emerged a new educated counter elite who organized an organization which was called Kshatriya Shamiti, as it claimed to be Kshatriyas in origin. It was formed in 1910, and from the very beginning it used a modern platform called Mandali Samitis, which were grassroots level democratic organizations which were started in many of the Rajbangshi villages to mobilize the group around their movement. The third example which I would mention is the Pods, is a caste called agricultural cultivating caste called Pods, who eventually came to be known as Pondras, and they claimed a Kshatriya status. And they also lived mainly in one district, in South Bengal, the district of 24 Parganas. And they too experienced some amount of social mobility as a result of the reclamation of the Sundarban forests, which started in the 19th century under colonial regime. So as a result, I mean, it was leased out as lots, and its lots, and some of them took the lots, became pioneer cultivators and to reclaim the land. And by the beginning of the 20th century, there were few small zamindars among the Pondras, and they formed their organization. And one of the difference between Namushudra, Rajbangshi, and the Pondra movement is that the Pondra movement from the very beginning was not exclusively community focused, because the community itself was smaller in number comparison to Namushudras and the Rajbangshis. So in 1910, they formed an organization called Bangyo Jana Sangha to bring all these Dalit and backward groups together into one organization. But it did not go very further. I'll discuss later on, because the movements remained very exclusively community focused until the 1920s. Now, we see these three groups, one in East Bengal, one in North Bengal, one in South Bengal. Comparatively, in West Bengal, there were no such large groups of Dalit caste who could mobilize around a new identity and articulate a social movement or later political movement. The Dalit caste in these areas were smaller and more marginal groups. And there were some dominant peasant castes like the Maheshos who were not interested in joining the scheduled caste movement because of the stigma attached to the whole concept. So we'll keep them out of this discussion. So in a way, West Bengal, Western districts remained a space where these movements did not develop. They developed mainly in East, North, and South Bengal. Now, initially, the socially mobile groups followed the usual models of social reform, claiming Brahmin or Kshatriya origins and reforming their ritual customs, which M.N. Srinivas has called Sanskritization. But I have seen these movements as more movements for appropriation rather than imitation, which Srinivas thought, because I think by claiming Brahmin status, by claiming Kshatriya status, they were appropriating certain symbols of power. For example, I'll give you one example. In the 20th century, there are references to the sacred thread, which many of these Dalit groups began to wear to claim their Brahmin or Kshatriya status. In Bengal Bhadralok society, the sacred thread was being referred to as Shiki Poisha Shuto, a thread worth quarter of a penny, if I translate it like that. Now, what does that mean? That means that a symbol, then an authentic symbol of Brahminical power is emptied of its meaning of power. And so, in other words, these acts of appropriation were also acts of protest. Very significantly, among the Namushudras, I can say, the Namushudras were claiming their Brahmin origin. But at the same time, they were denying the Brahmin priests the right to officiate in their ritual functions. Soon in the 20th century, we find the Gosais of the Motua sect. They evolved their own rituals for marriage and Shraddh ceremonies. And instead of traditional Brahmin priests, they were officiating in their own festivals. But at the same time, I would say that the intellectual content of their movement, the ideological content, the religious philosophy of their movement was not entirely intellectually autonomous, as they selectively appropriated aspects of Smarta Puranic Hindu philosophy, which I can go on later on in details if you want. But this was most conspicuous in their attitudes to women. For the Motuas and the Namushudras, one of the major aspects of it is that when the Motua religious movement started, it gave women equal status in the congregational life of the sect. The women and men sang equally and on an equal footing in the congregations of the sect. But at the same time, in the Motua religious songs, we find elements where the freedom of women were being carved. We find reference that previously Namushudra women could go to the market to sell their agricultural produce. But as the movement started, social movement started, those kind of activities were discouraged and so on. So in other words, we do not see the total kind of intellectual autonomy, and we find selective appropriation of these kind of rituals from among the upper castes. But there was no such ambivalence in their political consciousness. They had a different reading of the colonial situation or the colonial rule, because to them, colonial rule was an improvement over a traditional past where the Hindu upper caste dominated the society, whereas colonial rule had thrown property open to everyone, thrown education and professions open to everyone, and they provided a kind of opportunity for social mobility for these classes. And in their journals, they continuously began to talk about these aspects. What is very significant, though, that the nationalist movement in Bengal was entirely dominated by the upper caste Bhadralok, who completely ignored these aspirations and grievances and political attitudes of this lower caste, which were already being ventilated through various outlets. So what happened as a result of this negligence, when the Swadeshi movement started against partition, the first partition of Bengal, and its main focus was in Eastern Bengal and Northern Bengal, particularly in Eastern Bengal, the Namushudra peasantry en masse rejected the Swadeshi movement. They just simply refused to participate in the movement. And when the Swadeshi volunteers tried to coerce them into the boycott movement, they actively resisted. There are various references to such acts of resistance. I have documented it in my book. If you want, you can say. And this apathy towards a Bhadralok upper caste dominated nationalist movement remained unbroken even during the Gandhian nationalist movement. And they did not participate in the non-cooperation movement in large numbers. They did not participate in the civil disobedience movement. Even evidence of their participation in the Quit India movement is very sparse. I could not see much evidence of that. So in other words, this apathy and rejection of a Bhadralok upper caste dominated nationalist movement remained in their minds, except the Ponros. The Ponros were more sympathetic to the Congress movement, and perhaps that was because of their small numbers, and that was because of they were more centered near remained more centered near Calcutta, and so on. Now, the other aspect which I mentioned initially at the beginning, these Dalit movements for a very long time remained community focused. There was no regional kind of Dalit movement in Bengal until very late in the mid-1926. In 1910, this Bungyo Janasangho experiment was started, but it did not go very far because of mutual rivalries. And it was only in 1926 that the Bengal Depressed Classes Association was formed. And as its political program and ideology, it's advocated separate electorate for the depressed classes. And they, in the pan-Indian debate around this electorate question, where MC Raja was supporting joint electorate and Dr. Ambedkar was supporting separate electorate, the Bengal Depressed Classes Association was in support of Ambedkar. But when Ambedkar had to sign the Pune Pact and abandon the principle of joint electorate in favor of reserved seats in joint, abandoned separate electorate and accepted reserved seats in the joint electorate, the Bengal Association was very, very frustrated. Even they issued press statements condemning Ambedkar for sacrificing the real political interests of the depressed classes. Excuse me. So what happened in the communal award, they had been given 10 reserved seats, but in the Pune Pact, they were given 30 reserved seats. And when, on the basis of that, 1935 Government of India Act incorporated these provisions, the 1937 election took place. By the time of 1937 election, almost the entire Dalit population in Bengal was against the Congress. And this was quite evident in the election results. Although I would like to add a caveat here, in the 1937 election, because of the high property and educational qualifications, only about 10% of the population could vote. But even then, if we take it as a kind of indication, out of these 30 reserved seats, Congress could win only 7 seats, and the rest of it were won by independent Dalit candidates who were against the Congress. And in the Legislative Assembly, they supported the Krishak Praja Party and Muslim League coalition for the new government. And it is argued that it is because of their support, the Congress's aspiration to form a new government was thwarted. In other words, this was the first evidence that a Dalit Muslim alliance could successfully resist the political ascendancy of the upper caste Bhadralok in Bengal. Now, this was up to 1937. But then in the 1940s, the Dalit protest movements, Dalit politics takes various other shifts. And here I would like to emphasize another significant aspect of Dalit movements and Dalit politics in Bengal. And that is to say that Dalit movements did not represent a homogeneous voice. When discussing, well, looking at these movements, we have to recognize that these movements were always very heterogeneous. There were various divisions within each group, and each divisions and each classes had their own aspirations and ambitions. Sometimes these ambitions and aspirations converged, and at that point we have a movement, but it was quite possible on other points, that convergence turned into divergence, and that divergence led to the weakening of the movements. And this heterogeneity became most conspicuous in the 1940s under the pressure of partition politics. What happens in terms of organization? One major event happens that in 1943, a very well-known Namushudra leader, Jogendranath Mandal, forms the Bengal branch of Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation, which Dr. Ambedkar had founded just a year before in 1942. And when the partition scheme was being discussed, Mandal and the Scheduled Caste Federation proposed and advocated a Dalit Muslim alliance. And because his main argument was that both Dalit and Muslims being peasants, it was a natural alliance of interest between the two. But this position was not liked by many Dalits themselves, particularly the Namushudras many Namushudras in Eastern Bengal. And so at this stage, just before 1946 election, many Namushudra leaders joined the Congress and the Congress Scheduled Caste League, which operated as part of a Congress. And the leader of this shift from more independent, non-Congress political position to an alliance with the Congress was led by no other person but P.R. Thakur, who was the leader of the Mutua movement of the Namushudras in Eastern Bengal. So his grandfather, who had mainly organized the Mutua movement, was very much against the Congress. So his grandson kind of takes the movement to the other direction. And that happens, that is the situation when the 1946 election was taking place. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But there were other heterogeneous tendencies, heterogeneous voices as well. This was also the time, 1946, when in North Bengal and Central Eastern Bengal, the Tebhaga movement started, which was a sharecroppers movement for a 2/3 share of the produce, and this was mainly led by the the provincial Kisan Sabha, which was under the control of the Communist Party of India. And who participated in this Itihāsa movement in North Bengal and Eastern Central Bengal? In North Bengal, it was mainly the Rajbangshi sharecroppers. In Central Bengal, it was, and East Bengal in Jessore, Khulna, it was mainly the Namushudris sharecroppers. And who they fought against? They fought against the local Jodhas. In the case of Rajbangshis, many of these Jodhas were Rajbangshis themselves. In other words, this communist mobilization along class lines kind of tended to kind of threaten the caste solidarity, particularly of the Rajbangshis, and the Kshatriya Samiti, their organization, tried to preach unity, but that did not really work until the Itihāsa movement itself kind of dissipated because of state repression. So this was another kind of heterogeneity in Dalit politics in the 1940s in Bengal. The other tendency, the other trend was from the mid-1930s, 1934-35, Hindu Mahasabha and its sister organizations like Bharat Shivashram Sangh, they were trying to mobilize the Dalit and the tribal population in support of Hindu nationalism. And many of them kind of positively responded because this was a very well-organized movement from the 1930s, which went into the 1940s, and with well-orchestrated and well-funded organizational structures. So as a result, what happened when the partition-related violence started, and the Dalit peasants and Dalit working class in Calcutta were not only innocent victims of this political violence and the communal violence, they were also the perpetrators in many of these violent incidents. The documentary evidence is still there. So this is another kind of situation which we need to keep in mind when looking at Dalit politics around this time. This disunity was amply reflected in the 1946 election, which took place just before the whole partition campaign gathered momentum. In this election, as we all know, the Scheduled Caste Federation had a disastrous result. And in Bengal, out of 30 reserved seats, it got just 1 seat. And Congress got 24 seats, and 1 seat went to a CPI candidate. And there were also 2 Hindu Sabha seats. So in other words, if we look at this result, it was exactly the reversal of the 1937 election. In the 1937 election, Congress won just 7 seats out of 30. And now Congress got 24 out of 30. And the Federation got just 1. Now, why this happened? There are complex reasons behind it. I cannot go into the details. I can come back during the question answer session. But one fact needs to be remembered, that the Scheduled Caste Federation was started in Bengal in 1943, in May 1943, if I am right. And the election was taking place in 1946. Within this 2.5 years, obviously the Federation did not have the time and resources to build this electoral infrastructure wherefrom it could compete with the giant political machine of the Congress. So what happened? In 30 reserved seats, the Federation and its political ally, the Kshatriya Samiti of the Rajbangshis, they fielded candidates only in 13 seats. And out of the 30 seats, 15 seats were uncontested. There were no other candidate other than a Congress candidate. And this, if we look at the physical, spatial location of these uncontested seats, these were mainly located in the Western Bengal districts, where, as I mentioned at the very beginning, historically, the Dalit movement was weak. So in a way, we can argue that the dual election system went against the Dalit candidates, which was very true. But it is also true that the Federation, being a new organization for just 2.5 years, could not build its organization to find candidates in more than half of the reserved seats. So as a result, it was kind of wiped off, but it will be a wrong reading of the election result that the Congress got an overwhelming mandate from the Dalit voters, because if we look at the results where it was contested, there the votes in favor of the independent candidates taken together was much more than what the winning Congress candidate got. So in other words, the opposition votes was divided between so many independent candidates. Now, so just before the partition, by 1946, the Dalit movements were kind of going in many directions. It was completely in disarray. The pressure of partition politics had disrupted the Dalit unity, Dalit autonomy, and so on. But partition did not help at all the Dalit population. What happened? Once again, it put the movement into complete disarray because the habitational space of two major groups, the Rajbangshis and the Namushudras, were divided. The entire Namushudras space, the 6 districts in which they were living, went to East Pakistan. And the Rajbangshi space was divided down the middle. Part of it went to East Pakistan, Dinajpur and part of Rajshahi district, and part of it remained in West Bengal. So in other words, as I said, the importance of space is rarely taken into consideration while looking at the Dalit movement. This loss of the habitational space was a major factor in disrupting Dalit movements in Bengal. How? Now, when the partition took place, particularly in the case of Namushudras, they did not immediately migrate. In Bengal, unlike Punjab, the post-partition migration did not take place in one go, like Punjab. In Bengal, the migration took place in waves. There were 2 or 3 waves. The first wave, where the mainly upper caste Hindus came from East Pakistan to West Bengal. But at that point of time, the Dalit peasants, the Namushudra peasants, did not migrate because Jogen Mandal and the Federation advised them not to come here, not to migrate. But beyond this political kind of instruction, there is another major factor. A peasant does not migrate, leave his land and home unless he is forced to. In Bengal, immediately the violence, the communal violence that took place before partition in 1946. The Noakhali riot, the Calcutta riot, and so on. But after the partition, after August 1947, there was not much violence to force these Dalit peasants to leave their land and come to the other side of the border. Jogen Mandal himself remained in Pakistan, became the chairman of the Pakistan Constituent Assembly, and eventually became the law minister and the education minister in the Pakistan Central Cabinet. So he advised the Dalit peasants not to move. But I would say the major reason why the Dalit peasants did not move was because lack of resources. Migration requires resources, not only financial resources, but also social and cultural resources, which these peasants did not have. But these Dalit peasants began to migrate in the second wave in 1950, after the riot of 1950, when 2.1 million refugees crossed from East Pakistan to West Bengal, and all available evidence suggests that about 70% of this new migration were the Dalit Namushudra peasants, who now became refugees. The Dalit now become refugee. But refugee is not a homogeneous category. Different classes of refugees were treated and rehabilitated differently in post-partition in India. The first wave of migrants, the first wave of refugees who came after in 47-48 were treated in one way. But when the Dalit peasant refugees began to come in 1950, and this migration went up to 1957, when the border was sealed, they were looked at as a burden. And they were not allowed to mix with the local population. They did not get a very fair deal from the Indian state. They were put into the refugee camps where the living conditions were appalling. And then they were rehabilitated in all parts of India, some in the neighboring states, some in the Andaman Islands, and some were sent to far off Dandakaranya, which was a large area of forest land in Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, that Chhattisgarh region, and where, as I have shown in my forthcoming book, where they were taken to be used as cheap forced labor. Rehabilitation was possibly a secondary kind of goal. Their forced labor, their cheap labor, and these were the agricultural pioneer cultivator class. So their expertise was required to clear the forest and develop that land, and they were used for in that way. So in other words, the Dalit refugees got a rough deal from the Indian state, and against this, they fought. So Dalit movements in post-independence West Bengal takes an altogether different shape and different model. And this becomes the refugee movement, which took place in 1959 and 1960 against the Dandakaranya project, against being forcibly moved to Dandakaranya. But ultimately, it was not successful. But as a result of this, Dalits being transformed into refugees, being members, being participants of the refugee politics, their caste identity got obfuscated. Very few people remember that these refugees were actually Dalit peasants, and they were raising the question that they were treated like this. What was the reason? Was it the reason that they were Dalit and therefore treated differently from the rest of the refugees who came earlier in 1947-48? On the other hand, the Rajbangshi movement took a very different turn after independence, because migration of the Rajbangshi into Rajbangshi territory was of a different kind. Half of the Rajbangshi territory went to East Pakistan, half remained in India. Many of the Rajbangshis came to the other side after 1950 and settled down in this area. But what happened in North Bengal was that these partition refugees who settled in North Bengal or who went to North Bengal were not only Rajbangshi refugees. There were also many upper caste Hindu refugees who came from East Pakistan. And eventually there were many other North Indians who began to migrate and settle down in North Bengal. As a result of that, the demographic composition of the North Bengal districts began to change, and the Rajbangshis began to feel that they were losing their dominance. And therefore, they began to develop a new idiom of protest, and this was the idiom of the sons of the soil. It is very interesting, when their social movement, Rajbangshi social movement had started, they were trying to come out of their tribal identity of Koch to develop a more Sanskritized identity. But now they were going back. They were invoking the Koch state formation, the tradition of Koch state formation, and claiming their autochthonous status in the states. And they also kind of embraced the Kamtapuri language, which is a dialect, local dialect, and around this, they demand a separate province or separate state of Kamtapur with 6 North Bengal districts. This was very powerful at one time, but it did not go very far because of the internal divisions within the movement. So in other words, in post-independence in West Bengal, we see the the Dalit movements, the organized Dalit movements were in complete disarray because their habitational spaces had been divided, appropriated, disrupted, and so on. And therefore, they did not have that power to socially mobilize or politically mobilize. But there has been a revival in recent years. I'll not go very deeper into it. The Motua Mahasangha has been revived in West Bengal. P.R. Thakur in 1964, he was totally frustrated with the Congress. He resigned from the Congress and revitalized the Motua Mahasangha. The Namasudra community, who were mainly the followers of the Motua movement, are now dispersed all over the Indian Union. In many states where they live, they do not even enjoy the scheduled caste status, and many of them were Andaman and various other northern and western states. So what P.R. Thakur did with Motua Mahasangha, he brought all these scattered people into an imagined spiritual space. So all these people began to affiliate themselves with the Motua Mahasangha in their annual festival with the Baruni Mela, which takes place in March. Thousands of people from various parts of India come for the pilgrimage. And in the border districts, in the two border districts where mostly these refugees settled, they are parts of this organization. And as a result, by 2009, the political parties in West Bengal kind of discovered that the Dalit politics, Dalit movement was reorganizing itself, and they again tried to appropriate it. There was competition. And as it happened in 1946, once again, as the broader political competition started and there were internal divisions within the movement, and right now the movement is divided between TMC and BJP as it came out in the last assembly election. But the other important aspect of this revival of Dalit movement is the emergence of a very articulate, powerful Dalit literature. In last few years, Dalit literature, Bangla or Bengali Dalit literature has come up in a big way in West Bengal. This is a new development. And the Dalit refugees particularly, they're speaking their stories. They're speaking their stories of displacement and the discrimination they have followed. And just recently, last year, the Bangla Dalit Academy, a literary academy, was formed to focus this movement, and this is a new movement to have an eye on. So with this more recent developments, I will conclude by just highlighting certain points which I was trying to drive at through illustrations. That is, we have to recognize the heterogeneity of Dalit consciousness. There was elements of protest, but there was also elements of accommodation. There were interests and aspirations of different classes. So within the Dalit groups, the class differentiation was taking place as limited social mobility was taking place as well. And these various groups various classes had different aspirations. So when there was a convergence of these different aspirations and ambitions, there was a movement, articulate movement. But when there was also divergence, the movement began to lose its autonomy, began to lose its powers, and so on. So we'll have to look at these movements through an intersectional approach of both caste and class. And also finally, as I have to emphasize, and this is my major point, that we have to take into account the importance of space in the history of Dalit movement, Dalit politics, anywhere. And it is most conspicuous in the Bengal case. And I'm sure if we look at the other places, we can see parallels. So with these words, I'll stop, and I'll be happy to take questions and go into more details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for this very eye-opening lecture of yours. As me personally, being from Bengal, knew very little about the Namushudras. And as you said yourself, like there has been a lot of literature coming up regarding the Motua community recently in Bengali literature, and that is how I also knew, these communities. But it was a really eye-opener, and I got to learn, and I do think everyone in this room and in the YouTube audience got to learn a lot of things. And now we'll start our Q&A session. There are some rules in the Q&A session. Then the pattern would be like I'll take one question from this room, and then the next question will be taken from the YouTube room, unless and until there are no questions in YouTube, or vice versa. People are welcome to directly interact with Professor Bandhopadhyay if they want to. So please go on and ask your questions.
Soham, there are a lot of people who have raised their hands, so you could just pick them out and go ahead and give each of them a chance.
Okay, there have been a lot of people. I think if Professor can pick them up one by one.
Can you help me on this? I'm not very efficient.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Then I'll do it.
If you could read out the questions, that will be very helpful for me.
Okay, but I think some people have raised their hands, so I'll just give them the first chance to interact.
Okay.
So, Mr. Siraj, please ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, sir. It was a very wonderful session. We got to know a lot about all the Dalit movement which was going on around in the Bengal. So my basic question and first question is, why was the people not focused around eradicating the caste system? As you said earlier, that there was a little focus for the caste system to be eradicated around.
Good question. I consider it to be one of the major contradictions or ambivalences of modernity in Bengal, because there was, from the very beginning, from the 19th century, when there was discussion on this question, there were two positions. One position was that obviously untouchability was bad, but there was a simultaneous or parallel position that caste system as such was a good system. Caste system was a good system in the sense it was a kind of harmonious system. It did not lead to any social conflict, unlike the Western class system, which was full of possibilities of class struggle and conflict. So this was also coming to be associated with a nationalist position, that this caste system is somewhat unique institution in the world. You cannot get it anywhere else. And it is through this institution that India could culturally assert its uniqueness, its separateness, and its superiority from the Western civilization, where the class system and so on kind of bred all kinds of conflict in the Western civilization. There was also another modernist kind of argument to justify this. The modernist argument was that hierarchy and classification is nothing unnatural. If you just bring in the natural sciences, and that you can see that there are classifications in even the animal world. There are classifications, hierarchies in the Western societies. So hierarchy is not anything unnatural. It was a kind of Western construct, Western colonial construct, to show it in bad light. It was not as bad as the Western observers were putting it to be. So in other words, caste system as an institution came to be associated with a nationalist position, that it was something to be proud of, not to be ashamed of, and therefore it had to be justified. Although they agreed that untouchability was a kind of aberration and it had to be eliminated. And it had to be eliminated mainly because we need to mobilize the Dalit population, the untouchable population, in the interest of the nation. So this contradiction, this ambivalence in modernity or Indian, and this was an Indian modernity, which which from the very beginning prevented any real anti-caste reform movement from developing in Bengal.
Okay, now we have a question from YouTube by Mr. Asif Mustafa. He says that, was there any particular policies adopted by the British imperialism for the upliftment of these Namushudras in economic and socio-cultural field?
Yes, the colonial government from the very beginning was in a patronizing mood. It was partly a kind of political position that the lower castes and the depressed classes will have to be supported and so on. And as a kind of counterpoint to the nationalist position, and to undercut the importance of nationalism and their claim to represent everyone. And also there was a genuine, in some official circles, there was a genuine kind of goodwill to look for and to look after these downtrodden people. So there were policies of reservation affirmative action policies and specific the Namushudra movement was specifically aligned with and given, many of the leaders were given awards and so on. But most importantly, it was the affirmative action from after 1935, the reservation of jobs and educational institutions and very generous education grants and so on. This became part of the colonial policies. And that was one of the reasons that these groups considered colonial government or colonial regime to be an improvement over the traditional past, where they could see only caste-based discrimination.
Okay, so I'll take a question from the chat box next, as it is by our teacher, Professor Avadish Kumar Shah. Well, the question is not, I can't get what the question is. So, sir, please, can you open your mic and ask the question? I request you, sir.
Yes, friend. Yes, am I audible, I think?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Sir, my question is during your talk, you have spoken that in 1936, it was only 7 seats owned by Congress, while in 1947, it was returned like to 24 seats was owned by Congress. So, what was the reason behind it that it was, you have already spoken that there was a division in the voting factor, but what was the main reason behind this after partition that this East Bengal was divided in Pakistan and the peoples were coming in the northern Bengal and western Bengal? Please.
No, I was referring to the election of 1946, that is just before the partition. So what happened? I mean, the election of 1946 was a very complex election. First of all, throughout India, it was a very polarized election. More than 90% voted for the 90% of the Hindus voted for the Congress. More than 90% of the Muslims voted for Muslim League. And one of the major issue of the election was the Pakistan or partition of India. And even Dr. Ambedkar has observed that in this election, the partition issue became so important that other issues became relatively unimportant. So this is one of the major feature of the 1946 election, which we need to keep in mind while analyzing the election result. Now, on the part of the Federation, the leaders, Jogen Mandal, thought that it was mainly because of the joint electorate, that when the joint electorate voted for this in the reserved constituency for scheduled caste candidates, they obviously voted for the Congress candidates. They would not vote for the federation candidates. Whereas if you add the vote share of all the other candidates in every seat, other candidates' votes taken together was more than what the Congress candidate had received. So which was very true. But the problem was this, exactly that the opposition vote against the Congress was divided among so many independents. Election has its own logic. I mean, it does not just happen that members of one community vote for one candidate. The election happened, the voters vote for many considerations. So what happened, the opposition vote against the Congress was divided among various independent candidates and the federation. But most importantly, what I think, that the federation had just been founded 2.5 years ago. They did not have much time to build their organizational network, particularly in the Western Bengal districts where historically Dalit movements were weak. There were no major support base. There were no major community which was organized, which would give it that kind of electoral support. And as I said, half of the reserved seats were not contested at all. There were only one Congress candidate in those seats. So in other words, the federation's organizational presence was so kind of inadequate in certain regions that they could not find a candidate. So in other words, but more importantly, and the final thing is that federation had already mentioned that they would support the Muslim League demand of Pakistan. And that went against the federation candidates because, as I said, this election of 1946 was to get a mandate for Muslim League. It was to get a mandate for Pakistan, for Congress. It was to get a mandate for United India. And in that kind of political environment, and then there was this major kind of wave of patriotism which had been created by the just finished Quit India movement. So in this kind of political environment, the federation candidates could not really stand against the Congress, which was very well equipped. Congress was a huge political machine with huge resources, and it was riding the wave, the tide of the political support generated by the Quit India movement and so on.
Okay. The next question is from YouTube. It's by Mr. Devabroto De. He says, can you shed some light regarding the present standpoint of Namasudra community as far as NRC and CAA is concerned?
I mean, I don't think there is a unified opinion on that. As I said, that one needs to recognize the heterogeneity of the political opinion of these groups. And I don't think there is a single opinion on NRC or anything among the Namushudras. Also, frankly speaking, I am not very up to date on this because for last more than 2 years I'm out of the country. I could not visit India or could not visit my friends, so I'm not very up to date on this. But what I could get from my friends and colleagues who work among these groups is that the opinion is very divided. They have a particular interest in the Citizenship Amendment Act. They do not, I mean, more important than NRC for them is the Citizenship Amendment Act, because these people, mostly being refugees, they face all kinds of problems on a day-to-day basis, questioning their citizenship status. So they were hoping that this new Citizenship Amendment Act would give them would resolve this citizenship issue once and for all for them. But there are others, a large section of them, who believe that the Amendment Act will not really help them, because the paperwork which will be required of them to prove their status, many of them just do not have that paperwork. So it's very divided, and this could be seen in the 2021 Assembly election. In the 2021 Assembly election, the Motua Namushudra vote was very divided. So yeah, I mean, there is no one position, but there are many positions among them. Thank you.
Okay. I would ask Mr. or Miss, I'm sorry if I'm guessing your gender incorrect, but Tannu Kaushik, please ask your question.
First of all, I'm a female, so yeah. And a very warm afternoon to you, sir. And so my question is, in order to gain special political privileges, the lower class elite consciously advocated an anti-Congress and pro-British stance, as evident like right after the Montfort proposal. The Rajvanshis and the Namashudra elite pressed for greater representation for depressed communities in Bengal, and as a result of these demands, the Reform Act of 1919 provided for the nomination of one representative of the depressed class to the Bengal legislature. So, would it be right to surmise that lower class elite consistently favored a political approach distinct from that of the nationalist mainstream?
Could you repeat the last part of your question?
Yeah, sure. So would it be right to surmise that lower class elite consistently favored a political approach distinct from that of the nationalist mainstream?
That's right. What was very significant from the beginning of representative institutions being introduced in colonial India, that they were dominated by the upper caste educated people, and the representation of the Dalit groups remained insignificant. Apart from few groups like Namushudras or Rajvanshis possibly had some representation in the local bodies like the union board or a district council, but on the legislative, but the broader legislative councils, they practically had very minimal, if not nil, representation. And to redress that, in 1919, a nominated nominated seat was created. And the problem is, as I said, that these counter elites had a legitimate aspiration to represent their communities in these legislative bodies, in these public institutions. And the problem was that nationalist leadership looked at these aspirations with doubt, and they looked at these movements as divisive movements, which they were not. And this was the major the contest that came up between Gandhi and Ambedkar, and later on in Bengal also we find this, that joint separate electorate does not necessarily or did not necessarily mean separation of these communities from the mainstream of the nation. The separate electorate meant that their political interests was treated as minority, was treated separately and given special representation to keep them above, to bring them above the line. But this was not seen in this way by the nationalist leadership, and that's why they kept on fighting for this. The major fight was around the communal award from the Round Table Conference onwards, between the joint electorate and the separate electorate. The Dalit position, majority Dalit position, was for separate electorate until the end of the colonial period. And if you read the Constituent Assembly debates, it was being debated later on as well in the Constituent Assembly itself, where some of the Dalit leaders were arguing that separate electorate does not really separate us. It only gives our interests a special treatment as a minority, and this was the redress the historic imbalance of power which had been going for thousands of years. So yes, it is a major issue which until the very end of the colonial period, and it went on through the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly.
Okay. The next question we have from YouTube. It's by Mr. Pronil Mridha. He says that his question is about the small left front parties and their relation with the Dalit marginalized people. Like, how do the AIFB or RSP deal with the people from these sections? Can you please elaborate on them?
The small parties, I do not really know much about the involvement of these parties, except the fact that RSP was very active among the Dalit refugees in the 1950s, but that was quite limited involvement. And beyond the 1960s, I haven't seen much existence, although I confess that I haven't seen the contemporary post-independence situation beyond the 1960s. My research ends in the 1960s. But until then, apart from their work in the refugee movement very overtly, I haven't seen any other evidence. Obviously, they were mobilizing groups in the countryside and they were working, but targeting specific Dalit groups for mobilization, sympathetically looking at their situations, their discrimination, identifying, recognizing caste system and untouchability or discrimination, social discrimination as a major issue. Those never came up from these smaller political parties in the political discourse of the West Bengal state, where in this left front regime, the major focus was on class and not on caste. And there was a kind of belief that the major division that exists in society was that of class, and if that class differentiation could be addressed, the other social differentiations could resolve themselves, but which did not happen.
Okay, I would ask Mr. Vikramaditya to please ask his question.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I have a question. My first question, sir, is I had read about a Dalit writer named Manoranjan Vyapari. He had joined the violent Naxal movement right after, in his teens, and he had come to India from Bangladesh at the time of partition. So can we say that the violent Naxal movements roped in, he was also a Namshudra. So can we say they roped in specific Namshudra members to include them in their agenda? And my second question, sir, was, sorry, sir. Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
Sir, my second question was that I had also read about, sir, I forgot my second question, sir.
Okay, just in response to your first question, yes, Manoranjan Vyapari is a very influential writer. If you read his autobiography, you will see what kind of predicament, what kind of suffering these Namushudra refugees had to go through after they came to West Bengal from East Pakistan after the 1950 riot. And when in 1954 the camps were closed, these refugees, the closing of the camps really meant the state withdrawing all support for these refugees, and they were asked to fend for themselves. and fending for themselves was either to go to Dandukaranya or or to march with the labor force, the unorganized labor force in the city. So Monoranjan did that. I mean, Monoranjan Bapari is a good friend of mine. So Monoranjan Bapari did that. He tried to have a living by as a kind of unorganized labor, and he suffered a lot about that. And when people suffer incessantly, they are attracted to radical political ideologies. And Naxal movement certainly attracted people who were going through immense, immeasurable suffering. It started from a tribal region in North Bengal. So it kind of mobilized the tribal people there. And it certainly did mobilize, did recruit some of the refugees, not, I wouldn't say not as Namushudra per se, but more as a refugee boy who was suffering and could not see. So if you read his autobiography, you'll see that when he joined this movement, he was not really thinking of a political ideology, of a political plan. He was just drifting. He was drifting into it, and he also drifted out of it. So, and eventually he's now joined the TMC, and he's now an MLA, and not just an MLA. He is now the chairperson of the Bangla Dalit Academy, which is a literary organization. So he has come a long way. But yes, Naxal movement definitely recruited many of these people.
Okay, the next question we have from YouTube. It's by Mr. Uday Shukla. He says, what will be the effect of CAA on Dalits in Bengal?
I don't really know. Because when the CAA actually comes in with the rules framed, the rules have not been framed, no one really knows. And the kind of paperwork they will be demanding, because many of these refugees, they were poor peasants. I mean, the peasants do not keep papers. So many of them do not have that the papers which might be required under this act. So I don't really know what will be the effect, because this is still the territory of the unknown.
Okay, so now I'll take a question from the chat box in the room. It's by Mr. Shujoy Kumar Bagh. He says, shall you call the Motuas who are living in West Bengal as a diasporic or victim diasporic community?
To a large extent, yes. The Motua community, the Motua sect is mostly, I mean, this is based on kind of anecdotal evidence. I tried to look for a paper trail, but the Motua Mahasangha organization does not have, at least they could not give me the membership record or anything like that. It has a large membership, and my anecdotal evidence is that this membership is largely the refugee population who have settled down in the two border districts of West Bengal, the Nadia district and the North 24 Parganas district. And also they belong to various states like Andaman, where many of them were settled, and the Dandakaranya areas in states like Chhattisgarh, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, and so on. And Maharashtra, of course, and where the branch organizations have been opened. So we can say that this is a diasporic organization, but a diaspora has now settled its roots in the new homeland. So it was a diaspora until P.R. Thakur kind of revived the Motua Mahasangha. The problem of the Namushudra Das refugees was that they were scattered all over the Indian Union. So there was not a single piece of land they could call their cultural habitat, their real homeland. And when the Motua Mahasangha was created, this created a virtual spiritual space, which they can once again call their homeland. And that's why every year they come to Thakurnagar, which is the main center of the Motua Mahasangha, for their annual festival. If you go there, you could see the emotional identification of this community with that space. So it was a diasporic community, but a diasporic community which is desperately trying to find its own space.
I'd request Ms. Dipannita Das to please ask her question.
Thank you so much for such an informative session. So my question is, what's your take on the process of Dalitization of these Namushudra groups in the current Bengali political scenario?
So what could you say once again, the process of?
Dalitization by Kanchalaya?
Okay, the process of Dalitization. Okay.
Yeah.
This is increasingly happening. This is increasingly happening because of the situation. The Dalit as a political identity is increasingly receiving more and more acceptance within this Namushudra and other communities. There was a time there, and possibly still some of the members of these communities would resent being called a Dalit because of their social mobility, their middle class status, and so on. But increasingly, a large section of them find that the marginalization is still a fact of life. And more and more, they realize the reality of social and political marginalization. They begin to articulate their Dalit identity. And so, yes, the process of Dalitization has been taking place, and there is more and more political consciousness. And as I just mentioned, the Dalit literature, the new Dalit literature that is coming up, the writings of Manoranjan Bapari just mentioned, they very assertively kind of talk about Dalit identity, which is also closely associated with the refugee identity, because most of, as I say, many, if not most, of the contributors to Dalit literature, I find coming from this refugee background. So in other words, it is happening, and certainly it will go a long way. The political myth that once became very powerful in Bengal, that caste does not matter in Bengal, that myth is being more and more exploded. I could end by saying that.
Also,
Okay,
so if I may ask my second question too, am I
Yes.
allowed?
Yeah. Go on.
Okay, thank you so much. So also you pointed out that M.N. Srinivas talks about the process of Sanskritization being a two-way process. So if you can touch upon the topic of how that affected the Bhadralok in the Bengali region, that would be really helpful.
Yes, I just mentioned the story about sacred thread. The sacred thread is a kind of, I would say, a rhetorical example that when this happened, and more and after the 1911 census, most of the caste associations in Bengal began to preach various kinds of reforms, social reforms, which impacted the condition of women very significantly. And they were preaching reforms of their rituals, of their funeral, the Shraddh rituals, and the wearing of the sacred thread, and so on. there were two kinds of reaction. The one kind of reaction was kind of, I would say, what should be the proper word to kind of attitude of ridicule, that these people are wanting to be Bhadralok, but that was limited. But on the other hand, there was also resistance, and the resistance was in cultural terms, like, as I said, there was a widespread kind of saying that Poite, the sacred thread, has lost its significance because everyone can now just buy it from the market and wear it. So in other words, as a result of that, one could argue that there was a reassertion of dominance. I mean, this is what I tried to argue. If you look at my book on the Namushudras, untouchability in the Bengal social situation was more a rhetoric of power. And when this Sanskritization movements were taking place, protest movements were taking place, the Bhadralok elite tolerated it to some extent. But when the Dalit crossed the limit, crossed the line, when the Dalit assertion threatened the privilege and dominance of these people, they were reminded very rudely of their place in society. So in other words, there was if Sanskritization had an effect on the Bhadralok community, I would say there was some amount of tolerance, but the tolerance would go when they would find that they are invading their space of power, they were jeopardizing their privileges. Then the Dalit would be reminded where they belonged, where their proper place was. So it acted more as a rhetoric of power than any physical. I mean, the physical kind of oppression were not that acute in the Bengal social situation during that period, but this rhetorical assertion of supremacy was certainly there.
Okay, so now we have a question again from YouTube. It's by Mr. Ansh Jaiswal. He says that most of these Dalit movements are largely class-based and they did not much participate in the mainstream freedom struggle. So what was the response of the Indian National Congress and how did they try to gain their support?
Yes, they did not participate in the nationalist movement, not because they were anti-national. They did not participate in the nationalist movement because they did not find anything to identify with or relate to in the political agenda of the nationalist parties. The only kind of movement that we can see in this period on the part of the mainstream, what we call mainstream nationalists, that is the Congress party, was Gandhi's Harijan campaign. But Gandhi's Harijan campaign in Bengal did not go very far. And there was very little enthusiasm for this program. And Congress formed the Congress Scheduled Caste League. And through this league, they tried to rope in some leaders. And this was happening mostly at the upper level. And at the bottom level, there was hardly any attempt to address the real grievances of these people. So the Congress continued to neglect and ignore these movements, these aspirations of the Dalit communities. And as a result, Dalit communities did not feel attracted to the agenda of nationalism. And the famous, I mean, if I can answer your question rhetorically by quoting Ambedkar, Ambedkar once said, "I'm not against Swaraj, but you have to tell me what share I will have of Swaraj when Swaraj comes." And that was precisely the question of these people. They were not against Swaraj, but the question was what share of Swaraj we would get when it comes. And that question was never addressed. that question of citizenship, that question of entitlement of these people was never addressed by the mainstream nationalist movement. There were isolated attempts by individual leaders, but not as at a large scale, at a grassroots level.
Okay, sir. Before asking the next participant to ask his question, I would really ask you do something, sir. Would you take all of the questions, because there is a swarm of questions still left to be answered, and there are still people dying to interact with you. So it's just a question by me.
My voice has started to choke. I mean, it is. What's your time? I mean, I can speak for another 15 minutes or so.
Okay, so we can have like 2 to 3 more questions.
It is about 12:42 in your time.
Yes.
So let's finish by 1 o'clock.
Okay, sir. Okay,
throat
sir.
is already sore.
Yes, sir. We do understand that. And that. So I would ask Mr. Ahmed Hussain, who has been bombarding the chat box with questions and has raised his hand for a very long time to ask his question.
Hello?
Are you there, Mr. Ahmed Hussain? Okay, since he's not here, I would ask Mr. Sambit Patnaik to please ask his question.
Greetings, sir. Pranam, sir. May I just switch on the video, sir? I just wanted to see you. Pranam, sir. Sir, I have a question, sir. What is the difference between Varna and Jati?
It's a very, very big question. I can't answer it in a few minutes. Very briefly, what Andre Bete, the famous sociologist, once wrote, Varna is the civilizational template. That is the 4 Varnas with the Panchamas at the bottom, the 5th group. This is a universal civilizational template which you can, and the Jati is a much more smaller group, which it is difficult to define a Jati. It is based, there are various attributes of a Jati, and these Jatis relate to each other according to the template. Say the Brahmin Varna is divided into various Jatis. So various Jatis are ranked or placed within that 5-fold template, which are civilizational, because Jati identity essentially is a local regional identity. Many of these Jatis are local regional group, and you won't know their social ritual position unless it is related to that civilizational template. So the civilizational template is kind of, which was a pan-Indian template, brings this together in a kind of uniform and mutually understandable scale. This is very roughly and rough and broad answer to your question.
Thank you, sir. Pranam, sir.
Please, Suhani Singh, please go.
Sir, as we all know that somewhere there is a major focus in any Dalit movement to establish equity in the society. So, sir, do you think that the constitution has failed to capture the true picture somewhere?
Well, I don't think constitution has failed. Constitution has given the recommendation of establishing an equitable society. But you can say that constitution has not been implemented. The provisions and the recommendations of the constitution, that's entirely another thing. Constitution is a document. The constitution provides for some provisions, and it rightly and provided for provisions to establish equity and justice in society. But it now depends on others, the political machinery, the executive committee, the branch of the government, to implement the provisions of the Constitution. So what I would say, the Constitution did not fail. We failed the Constitution.
Okay, I would ask Ms. Pallavi Deshi to ask her question. She has been there for a very long time. So please ask your question.
Hello, sir. My question is, do you think that Bengal Dalit movement, the organized one, is quite later than other Dalit community of India, especially the Dalit movement of Maharashtra? And if so, why?
If you look historically, Dalit movements developed in Bengal at the same time as Dalit movements in other parts of India. So in terms of historical time frame, it started from the 19th century. It started germinating from the mid-19th century. It was certainly powerful by the late 19th century, and it was fully organized by the beginning of the 20th century. And around the same time, you find similar movements in Maharashtra, similar movements in North India, and similar movements in South India. So in terms of historical period, it is not late. But what happened, other parts of India did not experience the disruptions of partition. It is the partition experience which disrupted these movements in West Bengal. And that is why we do not find in immediate post-independence West Bengal any articulate movement, because two of the more organized articulate groups were completely in disarray as a result of partition. So partition made a major difference in the history of Dalit articulation and movement in West Bengal. But historically, in the colonial period, the movement started and were as powerful as movements in other parts of India.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Okay, I would ask Mr. Om Shiv to please ask his question. Sir, you're on mute. Okay, seems he's gone. So, Anonymous, you can ask your question.
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I have been wondering about the Matua community since because of the 2021 assembly elections. So my question is that during this lockdown, I was reading about Ambedkar, and he said that he gave a practical solution regarding the eradication of the caste system, which is marriage. He said that when intercaste marriage is acceptable among the in the society, then there is complete eradication of the caste system as whole. So in Bengal, have we seen any such practical solutions given by the leaders who led the caste movements? So my question is this.
No. Yes, I mean, endogamy is the bedrock of caste. When endogamy goes, caste will go. And therefore, those who want to maintain caste, they will never allow intercaste marriage. What happens in the past, in the colonial period, in the historical period, we do not see any movement, any caste movement, because when the Dalits speak of intercaste marriage, it does not mean anything. Intercaste marriage can happen only from above. So Dalit groups, they do not, they're less effective in this kind of movement. And among the upper caste social reform movements, no, the intercaste marriage was never actively advocated. And in fact, it was opposed. in real terms, and because, as I said, that caste system as a normative system determining the attributes of status, that was upheld and kind of justified by the conservative and by the upper caste Bhadralok society all through the historical period. But there are instances of intercaste marriage going forward, and with the passage of time these days, I find there's more acceptability of intercaste marriage. But no, there was no organized social movement to promote that, because there was no organized social movement to dismantle the caste system. Until now, I have not seen in Bengal any movement which was organized to dismantle caste, specifically targeting the system to be dismantled.
Okay, so then other than oh, I'm sorry if I'm asking another question. Actually, other than marriage, is there any other solution, practical solution based given by the caste leaders to eradicate the system other than marriage?
Other than marriage, the only movement, social movement that happened in the colonial period was the water acceptance movement. Because if you look at the social discrimination patterns in Bengal, it is mainly the distinction about acceptance of water. Who can accept water from whom? And therefore the castes are classified as Jolchol and Ojolchol. Jolchol means from those the Brahmins can accept water, and Ojolchol were those from whom the Brahmins cannot accept water. The Ojolchols were the lower caste Dalits. So one of the strategies of the nationalist movement was to kind of promote acceptance of water from the hands of the Dalit groups, and there were organized kind of celebrations where these people were invited and the Congress leaders went there and accepted water from their hands. But these were mainly ceremonial kind of occasions. This did not go very far into the society. So that was the only endeavor that was initiated or undertaken by the nationalist Bhadralok in the colonial history. But beyond that, there was nothing.
Okay. So I think we cannot accommodate any more questions. I'm really sorry to everyone who has swarmed the chat box and who has raised their hands, but sir has been in like answering your questions for the last 1 hour, and I don't want to give him any more pain to his throat. So we are concluding this session. Please, everyone who is present here, fill up the feedback form. And we know we have many follies that we couldn't give you chance to enter the room. We couldn't give you chance to ask your questions. So please tell us about our follies as well. Or if you enjoyed the lecture, please tell us about that. Your views matter a lot to us. As finally, I would like the convener of IQAC, Delhi College of Arts and Commerce, Mr. Shrikant Pandey sir, to please give the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Soham. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Soham, for giving me this opportunity. Before thanking Professor Bandhopadhyay for such an excellent talk on such an important topic, I would like to express my thanks not as a convener of IQAC, but as a teacher and learner of social movements in India, because that is the course which I have been taking. So it was so meaningful for me as a learner on this topic. Having said that, I would like to thank Professor Bandhopadhyay on behalf of Delhi College of Arts and Commerce for giving a valuable time and presenting such a beautiful presentation. I think everybody not only enjoyed, but everybody has learned in detail about this topic. I would also thank Professor Amrit ma'am, our officiating principal, for being there. Thanks are due to Niru Elabadi ma'am, not only because she is teaching history and she has been engaging in all such activities, but she has in fact been overlooking all the webinars which the college has been conducting. Thanks to Soham for conducting this webinar in such a organized manner, and sincere thanks to all the participants who took time off and got benefited from such an enlightening lecture by Professor Sekhar Bandhopadhyay, sir. Thank you very much, sir. We would like to have you once again whenever you get time, whenever you can spare some time. There are many things which still needs to be discussed and deliberated upon, and this will be a request from me personally, because I have been taking this course in this college on social movements. So hoping to see you again, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, again for your very precious time, and especially for the very tiring and the gruesome Q&A session that you undertook.
I like Q&A session, but after, I think I have spoken for 2 hours. After speaking at a stretch for 2 hours, my throat begins to crack.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a
Not a
lot,
problem.
sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. It was a good session.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the Q&A session.
Thank you, sir, so
Thanks
much.
a lot, sir.
And look forward to
Thank
next
you
one
so much,
also,
sir.
whenever get chance.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you
sir.
so much, sir.
All right.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Okay.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
sir, for the nice guest.
Thank you, sir.
So very well done.
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations to the entire team